How's it going, everyone? It's Harvey from Weather Storm 1000, and in this video, we're going to focus on Tropical Storm Julia, which is now likely to become a hurricane in the very near future and potentially make landfall as a hurricane somewhere along the Nicaragua coast as a hurricane this weekend. And we'll also determine if Tropical Storm Julia has a possibility of potentially becoming a United States threat in the more long-term future as it heads closer and closer to the Gulf of Mexico. But before I begin, make sure to subscribe if you want to see more weather content. So let's begin by taking a look at the water vapor imagery for Tropical Storm Julia at this time, and we do see that there's a high amount of convection going on over pretty much all throughout this tropical disturbance. However, it still doesn't really have a well-defined center of circulation just yet. There is a blowup of convection going on right around the center of circulation. However, we aren't seeing a strong amount of convection on all sides of the center of circulation, which is the reason why it isn't necessarily considered a stronger tropical storm or hurricane yet, because the air pressure is still relatively high, even though we're seeing a lot of convection going on, and we're going to need to wait and see for the convection to filter in on all sides of the center of circulation before we can confidently say that the wind speed will be considered a hurricane status, which I think is likely as this continues to head for westward. Because if we were to take a look at the water vapor imagery like you see right here, the wind shear is very light and there isn't a lot of dry air either, so this has an open opportunity to continue to organize itself, but it has a limited amount of time, which is certainly good news that it won't have a lot of time for it to strengthen into potentially a more powerful tropical cyclone. However, it is still expected to be powerful enough to bring major impacts along Central America, even going further inland where flooding is likely associated with Julia. Now, take a look at the wind shear map, and we do see that there's a light amount of wind shear over this storm, as the wind shear won't really play a role in terms of disorganizing it, which is definitely a major concern because this will allow it to continue to strengthen as it heads further westward. Now, in terms of certainty with the forecast, it's very high at this point. This is going to make landfall somewhere in Nicaragua. It's almost inevitable at this point. There's still uncertainty whether or not this will make landfall as a hurricane or not. There is that possibility that maybe it just stays around tropical storm status. However, the current consensus from the computer models is that this should make landfall as a category 1 hurricane. If we were to take a look at what the European model is stating, let me zoom in so you guys get a better idea. We do see that the European model wants to take a landfall where the millibar pressure drops down 986 millibars. That's considered a category 1 hurricane at that point. So you should expect major impacts and hurricane-like impacts along the coast of Nicaragua and even further inland, where we're going to see those gusty winds and heavy rain move very far inland, where we still see a heavy amount of rain impact El Salvador, Guatemala, and of course Honduras. So you need to pay very close attention if you live in any of these Central American countries, because a major flash flood threat is likely associated with thunderstorm activity like this associated with Julia. However, you're probably wondering what will happen beyond Central America with Tropical Storm Julia. So if I were to show you guys what the European model is stating, we do see that Julia eventually moves into Mexico, and we see a decent amount of energy associated with Julia move northward, and we in fact do see a low pressure system develop in the Gulf of Mexico. Now, I'll say that if this low pressure system were to develop under these circumstances, it'll primarily develop as a result of baroclinic influences. Of course, since we're entering the month of October, we're going to continue to see more polar vortexes move through, bring a lot of that cold air further southward, and as a result, that should increase the wind speed overall for the mid latitudes of the northern hemisphere. So if this were to develop under these circumstances, it's likely will develop due to baroclinic influences such as the cold dense air trying to filter into this warm tropical core that Julia will still have, and that will create could create a fairly powerful low pressure system, where we do see the millibar pressure drop down to right around tropical storm status, and the European model takes a landfall near tropical storm status. Now, I don't know if this will be considered a tropical storm because, like I said, it's gonna have a lot of baroclinic influences that are gonna help strengthen this storm. And if it weren't for that, this storm would just fizzle out due to the very strong wind shear that's gonna exist in the northern Gulf of Mexico. However, this still is something to pay close. This could be something to pay close attention to, whether this will be considered a tropical storm or not, because it could potentially bring gusty winds and heavier rainfall if the remnants of Julia were to develop in the Gulf of Mexico, whether, like I said, whether it's tropical or not. So we're going to need to pay close attention to that. Taking a look at what the GFS model is stating. The GFS model always been the model that's been more lenient on taking Julia further northward, and that's what the GFS model exactly does, where we do see a well-defined low pressure system develop in the Gulf of Mexico, but the GFS model eventually does fizzle it out, as it doesn't expect the jet stream to dip down as far south as the European model, which is the reason why it isn't getting a lot of help from baroclinic influences or really strengthening. It's just going to fizzle out to the wind shear, and the wind shear in the GFS model scenario is a bit stronger and a little bit further southward. If I were to show you guys, you see there's a strong amount of wind shear to the north. Compare that to the European model at the same time period at around the 138-hour mark. We do see that while there is wind shear, the wind shear is primarily coming from the south, so the storm and the upper level winds are moving the same direction for this to potentially strengthen. So still a lot to pay close attention to. Of course, the steering currents will play another role, because we're going to need to see if this will turn far north enough to where it'll enter the Gulf of Mexico, or will just move further westward, hug the Mexican coast, and just fizzle out. That's still a possibility as well. Really all depends on how much ridging there will be just to the north of it, and there seems to be some disagreements with the computer models regarding that, because we do see that the European model been more lenient on taking the storm further westward, where we do see the ridging a little bit stronger and there's less of a weakness in ridging. Compare that to the GFS model at the same time period at the 108-hour mark. We do see that the GFS model expects by the 108-hour mark for this ridge to completely weaken, for this to allow this storm to move a lot further northward a lot earlier. So that will play another role. How strong will this ridge be to really determine the track of this? But still far out. I'll keep you guys updated if there's any sort of major significant certainty changes with the forecast. But as of right now, it still seems a bit uncertain, but at least pay close attention to this if you're along the southern Gulf of Mexico coast. Now, of course, what's inevitable at this point is that Central America will experience hurricane-like impacts, as this will likely make landfall as a hurricane, and you need to pay very close attention to a major flood threat. And if I were to show you guys the water vapor, there won't be much dry air to inhibit it, and the wind shear will be very light. So this has an open opportunity to develop, make landfall as a strong hurricane. And I emphasize, guys, just stay prepared and hunker down, because this could be a lot more significant than you think, even though it's still technically considered Category 1 hurricane. Category 1 hurricanes are still very powerful and something you don't want to mess around with. So make sure to take the right precautions all throughout Central America, especially if you live in a flood-prone area. Now, taking a look at what the ensemble members are stating at this time, we do see that there's pretty much an inevitable agreement that this will make landfall in Nicaragua as hurricane warnings are issued. And beyond that, we do see some computer models move a little bit further northward, while some pretty much take Julia to the Eastern Pacific and not really move it to the Gulf of Mexico. So we're going to need to wait and see which scenario will be the correct one. And even though the northern ones don't necessarily move towards the Gulf of Mexico, there still could be that possibility that the energy associated with Julia, at least some of the energy and convection associated with Julia, moves into the Gulf of Mexico and has a chance to develop into its own entity, into its own new tropical storm, which is certainly a possibility, but we're going to need to wait and see if that's going to be the case. Really all depends on how far north this will move, to really depend how much of Julia's energy will move towards the Gulf of Mexico. Now, taking a look at the model intensity guidance, we do see that while most of the ensemble members do remain this at tropical storm status, I want to emphasize that the model intensity guidance typically tends to underestimate the storm strength. So more likely, I think a category 1 before landfall is it will be in the cards for Nicaragua. So I'd prepare for a category 1 type hurricane to make landfall, as I still think that's the most likely scenario for the coast of Nicaragua. Now, taking a look at the rainfall, you should expect pretty much a large portion of Nicaragua, Honduras, and even extending to Guatemala and portions of Belize could expect 5 to 8 inches, and a larger area of 3 to 6 inches. Even extending further southward towards Costa Rica and Panama, you could experience heavy rainfall associated with Julia. So you need to prepare for that possibility of a major flood threat all throughout Central America. Now, taking a look at my forecast when it comes to potential Hurricane Julia, I do expect this to strengthen into Category 1 hurricane just before landfall, when the landfall should be right around Sunday morning for Nicaragua. I do expect it to strengthen into a 90-mile-per-hour storm, as all the factors are pretty much going in Julia's favor when it comes to strengthening, which is certainly not good news. So make sure to prepare. And for the United States, while it's still uncertain, I'll keep you guys updated if there's any major changes with the forecast over the next several days. But anyways, guys, I thank you guys for watching. Make sure to subscribe if you want to see more weather content, and I hope you guys have a great day.